Yeah, let's circle back. I think, just like how the greater will makes a cycle of rebirth and death, we go from the beginning of the game to the end, and
That works for me.
there's a storytelling concept where you can tell the concept of a macro level thing with micro level storytelling. Like how you can get the vibe of a city from one person in that city's life, or how you can get the idea of many people in the city's life from the vibe of the city. So I think that Elden Ring actually follows those storytelling tenets really well, with the idea of how it gets into all of its different themes really tightly with like these individual character storylines, and then those all tie back into the major overarching theme of the main story.
No, wait. Well, the Black Knife's fleeing is because they just killed Godot. They just killed him. Oh no, they just killed Godwin.
They killed Godwin. Yeah, you got me. This is like four different.
Who the fuck is Godofroy? You'll tell me who Godofroy is.
Well, if you think about it, the Pharaoh's Lockstones are sort of in a way equivalent to the little imp statue, the stone daggers that you get to use to unlock secret pathways and secret treasures. And
hey, all right, whoa, that makes too much sense, and no one has talked about it. Don't drop these bombs on me.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Roundtable Hold. Tonight you are listening to episode 3 of Elden Ring Discussion. This is Gideon the Half-Knowing and my co-host Cosmosis. Tonight we will be discussing Elden Ring lore. How are you doing, Cosmosis?
I'm doing really good. I'm really excited to kind of hear your thoughts on the lore document you wrote, and then on Elden Ring lore in general. It's definitely a lot to unpack with such a big subject, so I'm pretty excited to get into it.
Yeah, I am too. It's been, I think my major motivation for getting back online in the first place was to talk about Elden Ring and its lore and its gameplay, so doing this episode has been an exciting thing for me.
Nice. Well, I guess one of the first things I wanted to ask before we got into the actual lore itself, for those of you out there that don't know, there is like an incredibly long and well-written lore document over on Reddit that we'll post a link to in the description. But I kind of wanted to figure out like what your inspiration was for doing that, because it doesn't seem like an easy or quick project. It looks like a lot of time was put into it and a lot of thought was put into it. So I was kind of wondering, what was behind that.
That's a really good question. Essentially, it's like my first playthrough, I was really just sort of awed by the fact that they were able to design a game like Elden Ring that throws you into its world with no prior knowledge about how anything works, even down to like how the weird and vague magic system works with glintstone sorcery and demigods and Empyreans. And by the end of the game, you can have twists like Geraint being Malakath, or Destined Death being like where it is, or Marika being Radagon, that can actually work as twists, even though they're matter-of-factly said to you, because of how the game's laid out. And that took me in so much that I just had to try and figure out all of the depths of the lore.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's really cool. I think in my first playthrough, I definitely got the big picture of like what was going on, who the Tarnished were, what was going on with the demigods. I had a general understanding of what Ronnie, what her part was in the shattering, and and how all of that came about. So I got like a pretty good general idea, but things like Radagon being Marika, and some of the other quest lines, and learning how other characters are intertwined, Hayata, for instance, those for me didn't come until second, third, and fourth playthroughs. So yeah, it's interesting. I feel like it's pretty easy to get like the general idea, even though it's a little confusing. But then when you really get into it, I feel like there's a lot of hidden, story per usual for a Souls-like game.
What I think is really interesting is, like you say, there's a veiled side of the lore, and then there's a very much more obvious side of the lore. In Dark Souls 1, you sort of see that play out as the divine prophecy that Frampt gives you is the one that's loudly spoken, but if you go to New Londo and you can figure out its history and figure out how Cath works, then you can get this whole secret. Is the Dark Age of Man really an evil thing type story? But it's all mysterious. And I think Elden Ring really brings that much more front and center. You know, you have your typical path of following the Two Fingers wisdom to become Lord. Um, and that path takes you all the way to the Morgott boss fight. And afterwards, you have this moment of doubt where Melina tells you that you have to burn the Erde tree, and you can figure out that you can take the Frenzied Flame. But other than that, it's a pretty straightforward approach, and by doing it, you can get the basic gist of all of the different stories. Like, you learn in Raya Lucaria how Renala went mad, how Rykard turned to blasphemy, how Radahn falls to madness from the flame and from the Scarlet Rot, you know? You learn about how Godric, surrendered to Millennia and how his grafting is some foul thing. But, there's some secrets you might never learn that are, like, part of that veiled side. Like, who is Mikola? Who's Millennia? You might find a little bit about Mog, the Lord of Blood, either in the catacombs, like the shunning grounds beneath Lindel, or in Mikola's, like, Nokron city. Well, I guess I should say it's Mog's secret place in Nokron that he takes Mikola to. But like that's all like the more secret side of it that's harder to get down. And even the Frenzied Flame has its own mysteries that you have to learn through a secret side quest with Hyetta that's sort of hard to complete.
One of the things that I like about those secret, lore and plot lines that you had mentioned is the foreshadowing, at the beginning of the game with the title screen. I think it's really cool how they foreshadow some of those hidden plot lines. One of the things in particular, which I was doing some research into today, someone had a theory. Moog. So everyone thinks that Mikola is inside that sack down in like Moog's blood palace. And this guy like brought up this whole thing where he's like, yeah, but in the title screen, like Moog is carrying that sack, but like Mikola is not inside of it. And he had this whole theory how it wasn't Mikola, which I thought was really interesting. I think it definitely needs some more work, but it was an interesting topic. Have you heard anything about that?
No, I haven't read a theory like that. I was under the impression that it was most likely Mikola and that the content for it was cut for a DLC with Dreams. But that's fascinating that there's a theory that just outright claims that he's not in the rebirthing cocoon, because it's like, where is he? And that'd be like a pretty big misdirect.
Yeah, he thought it was in the chair above like the Phantom version of Godfrey, where you get the Laws of Regression spellbook. He thought that the body in that was Mikola. I'll have to send you some links over to the theory. It was fairly interesting, and he brought in just the appearance of the characters, as well as some of the stuff from the intro theme and a few other things where he kind of brought it together. And he was like, I could be right or I could be wrong, but enough of it made sense that I was like, huh, that's an interesting take. But it's kind of cool that some of the stuff is so hidden, it leads people just to kind of create these theories and see what they can find, which I think in part, although almost all of your lore document seems to have sources for all of it, I think there is like some interesting speculation in there, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the core things I like a lot about the Soulsborne games is that there's at some point, at some level, there's going to be a leap of faith in your logic where you have to speculate on how one thing attaches to another. And from that speculation, you can come up with how a story emerges. And obviously with this guy, he focused on how Mikola's connection to Radagon and like the law of regression and how that was embodied in the Golden Order Principia above Godfrey. So it's just fascinating to see how you can, when you scope in on different years of the lore to try and look at it, you can find a lot of different stories that emerge.
One of the major ones, and I do want to start getting into maybe some of the chronological, history with the lore, but one of the major ones that kind of I thought was the most interesting was at what point did Marika become Radagon or Radagon become Marika, or like was it like that the whole time? Like I feel like that concept isn't really explained. Like I know that it's said that they're one and the same, but like for me, and I don't even necessarily think this is based on anything in particular in the game, but to me it seems like at one point they definitely were separate. But I've also heard theories that they always were one and the same, and I think that's like a really interesting topic. I was wondering if you had any. thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, I think I think America's identities is one of the most contentious part of the Elden Ring debate, like and how it ties into the lore, because Marika, as the eternal queen of Landel and the Golden Order, is the most pivotal and central character of the entire plot. So who she is and what she does affects how you read everything else, because it all ties back to her. Like there's one of the two finger maidens in the Altus Plateau has this quote where she's like talking about Rykard and Morgott, but she ends it with saying that it all comes from the curse of Marika, the curse of what she's done when making the Golden Order. If that's
Mm-hmm.
bad or good, do you condemn her? Do you not? It depends on the ending you choose. Personally, I think that Marika was always Radagon. I think that there's intentionally no mention of like a wedding or anything, and like because Marika's bed chambers are so removed, I think it makes sense that they would be one and the same from the beginning. I know that that's a pretty contentious thing to say, but I think it, along with Marika being the Glomide Queen, is like the best way to read into a lot of the Elden Ring lore, and it's what I've based my document on, most of its reading. Um,
No, I thought that was another interesting thing too, is how you got to the conclusion that America was the Glomide Queen, because I've seen a couple people with that similar thought that you had, and then I've also seen the opposite, where some people were like, "Well, it would have been impossible for her to be the Glomide Queen." So I definitely like to break that down a little bit more as well, and how you reach that conclusion.
I think that's a really big, important topic to discuss as well. I think really the best way to approach it is to start from the beginning, though, from the very, very beginning, in the age of ancients, the prehistory of Elden Ring.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into it. Where does it start?
Well, as Hyetta says, when she receives the wisdom of the three fingers from the burnt Elden Lord, well, will be Elden Lord, she says that everything came from the one great, and from that came fractures and births and souls. And I think that line's pretty important because it implies that everything stems from one being. And when you compare that to the Golden Order's fundamentalism, how it knows about the law of regression and the laws of causality, it makes sense to understand that everything that happens is fracturing from the same, like, original slate, But the
Yeah,
regression
fractals.
factor, yeah, exactly. But the regression factor will always make it yearn to go back. And I think that that manifests itself within the actual world as the misery and the horrible things that happen that lead people to accepting the frenzied flame into themselves.
Mm.
And it even describes the frenzied flame at times as a curse. Like the merchant caravan that was imprisoned deep beneath Landel in the Tomb of the Three Fingers was imprisoned because, in part, due to their worship, or at least their affliction of the frenzied flame, whether that was willing from any of them or not. So I actually saw this Reddit post a while back after recording our second episode. It was really fascinating. It essentially said that when Hayeda mentions the one great, that might be Placidusix, essentially. And I mean, that's something that
That
I think a
that
lot
would
of
make
people have
sense.
assumed at this point. But it goes from that to say that Placidusix, because of his position in the arena, like his boss fight, his position matches that of the two fingers. The way that they arch. And we
Hmm.
know that Placidusix once had 5 heads. He theorizes that the other 3 ancient dragons mentioned from the Ancient Dragon War, Lanciax, Fortisax, and Grantsax, were all once part of Placidusix. They went to Landel and attacked. Grantsax died in the attack. They were then routed on the field of Altus Plateau, where Fortisax was defeated and joined Landel. And then finally, somewhere in Liurnia, perhaps, or somewhere in Rygard's area, Lanciax was defeated, and she also joined the Ancient Dragon Cult. Anyway, in that way, you end up with the 2 fingers and the 3 fingers. I left a comment on it that was sort of elaborating based off of my own views of it, but essentially, if you imagine the major bridge between the prehistory and the age of the Erde Tree is the birth of the Erde Tree, but that's only allowed by the birth of the greater will and its influence on the world, which begins with the Elden beasts crashing into Farum Azula. Or, well, The Elden Beast crashing into Farum Azula is in and of itself a speculation. Long ago, this Farum Azula was struck by a meteorite, and long ago, in a rain of stars, the Elden Beast was most likely sent to the lands between.
Right.
And it fits that it would have hit the Farum Azula as Placidusix was the first Elden Lord. And from him being the first Elden Lord comes the beginning of history, because from Placidusix becoming the Elden Lord begins a similar chain of events that go back to Dark Souls 1's birth of the First Flame. It's the ending of the Age of Ancients, where everything was grey and undefined, where everything was sort of held in stasis, and it's the beginning of history, you know? Like, the Greater Will allows for runes to exist, it allows for the Two Fingers to follow its wisdom, and possibly due to it being able to allow the runes, a stretch of logic could be that Placidusix used the rune of rebirth or unbirth. The Renala's great rune.
Right.
He uses that rune to rebirth himself into Empyrean flesh, and that form is the Two Fingers. And then the Three Fingers are cleansed from that form to lock away the frenzied flame. Because if Placidusix is the beginning of everything, then he would be like, that's where everything stems from, including the frenzied flame, including all sorts of different ancient powers of the world. It's a very big stretch of logic, but it's very
Well, I
fascinating.
mean, the thing is that it does make sense. Like listening to it, it does make sense to me. And just kind of as a side note, I know you kind of jumped back into Dark Souls there for a second, but I was thinking about the fact that you were talking about the fracturing and how it it all comes from the same point, but then it eventually always wants to return to that point. And I think that's like the overall theme in Dark Souls as well, with rekindling the flame, and then like whether or not you're going to be in that age or in the age of darkness, but that you're constantly like cycling through them, and then it happens over and over again. It seems like that is kind of like a parallel plot line to based on what you just described, or at least that's what I got from it.
I think that's a very fair comparison. There's just an endless cycle of complexity and new fractures and new things that can come from cycling the same thing. It's like the same but different every time, as if you branch out and then regress and then branch out and then regress and then branch out, but all in the same patterns as before, but in a different way.
hmm The other thing that I think helps it make sense, like I can see like where have such a bad hard name pronouncing his name. So the other thing that makes sense with Placidusix, separating with the dragons is the five fingers are the three fingers and the two fingers are blatantly part of the same thing. Like there's like no question in anyone's mind, I would hope, that they were at one point five fingers and then had separated.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that the only mention of the five fingers in the game is this vague illusion. It's got like a funky name. I can't remember. It's like the cinqueta, and it's the knife that Gurink uses. That when he stabs into his medallion, it turns into the hilt of his black blade when he turns into Malakath.
Hmm.
But that's called the cinqueta, and it's supposed to look like five fingers to symbolize the intelligence once granted to the Beastmen. So
I
if you
remember
consider
this.
Placidusix, yeah. So if you remember Placidusix as like the god of the Beastmen, then it makes sense that he would be aligned with the concept of the five fingers. But that's been so long forgotten because they only know the two fingers because the two fingers were purified and cleansed of their three-finger form during the War of the Ancient Dragons. It's like something even more fascinating is that the five fingers that Malekith has on his dagger, that only makes up the hilt. What the blade is this sort of black. It looks like the red black essence of destined death. The stuff that comes out of his black blade.
Yep.
And the fact that the knife that has a hand when it stabs into his hilt, like into his rune, it draws out the blade that has the rune of death. It's like he's grasping destined death.
hmm Yeah,
And
it's really
it's
cool.
yeah. I think that gets into some of like the sort of like symbolism that's used in the game that even the developers are sort of vague on. It's just like the endless sort of like what if, because that
Mhm.
red tint of Destined to Death matches primordial gold, according to one of the Crucible Knights
Hmm.
descriptions.
Okay.
And primordial gold as a concept is supposed to be the same. Like primordial gold is Placidusix. He was the ancient dragon with the golden scales, and the holiest of the ancient dragons were the ones that had golden scales that took after Placidusix.
Yeah.
So if primordial gold was tinted red, then it sort of gets into this vague concept that the only true immortality is death. Like a true death is I don't know, like a true death permanently ends something, but that permanence is like the only immortality it feels like is sort of the theme, but like it's very vague and I find it fascinating. When I read that I was like, oh.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I guess I was surprised there. I thought you were about to say that like you take the death and then there's like rebirth. I was surprised to hear you say that the death the eternal death is like the only permanent thing going on. I pictured it going the other way just because it, like you said, everything sort of like fractals itself and you end up seeing it later.
Well,
No,
I
I
think
guess I guess what you said makes sense. I think I get where you're going with it.
but no, I mean you've got a really good take on it too, is the thing. It's like in the prehistory, essentially they have this cycle of of death and rebirth in the
And
form of the
it was celebrated too, like down in Nokron, or the where the ancestral spirits are and stuff, and the buds and all that, like they celebrated death because it was rebirth. And then you have like, I guess, that interesting concept of like America, like essentially like kind of like banning death, right? And just trying to, is am I wrong on that one? She
No,
more
no,
or
you're
less
totally right.
helped like lock away the rune of death and tried to prevent death from happening, which I think like really screwed up the cycle that they had going. And I think there's like a lot of different cultures within the game that all kind of like celebrated death in their own way in its cycle, but it always ended up with like some kind of rebirth. And I think by her and the greater will trying to stop death from happening is probably the start of like this downhill thing that needs to get sorted out, although it is still probably part of this greater cycle.
No, I mean that's really well put. I One of the how people deal with death is one of the major themes of Elden Ring. It's brought up in pretty much every single type of ending philosophy. How the cycle will continue is like what matters. And in the prehistory, you can see it really defined in variations before the Golden Order folds everything into itself, because you have, like you say, you've got the Scarlet Rot, which is worshipped by both those people. By essentially, it's worshipped by the pest. It's worshipped by a sort of no longer existent cast of nobles that would have built the Ul Palace, and they wore like fungal attire as
Yep.
imagery to worship the Scarlet Goddess. And then you've got the ancestral followers who follow the rebirth aspect of that. They know that in every rebirth is death, that the spirits that they follow, the ancestral spirits that have the buds grow from their horns, are born of death that comes from the rot and, the eventual death of everything.
Yeah. It kind of makes the greater will seem somewhat imperial to be like locking these other, like if you don't accept the greater will, then whatever you believe in, we're going to lock you into the far corners of the world, so you
There's
don't.
even There's even a quote from America that says that exactly. It's so good. It's somewhere near the Dectus lift. When Melissa says in America's own words, the choice is fine. Become one with the order or divest thyself of it. To wallow at the fringes, a powerless upstart. Like, you have the option to leave the order at any time. You have the option to go your own way, but the greater will imposes a permanence on it, an imperialist ultimatum. You no longer have the option of choosing to live as you will. You have to follow the way or you have to rebel against it. There's no in between.
Mhm. And rebelling typically results in, yeah, you being pushed to the fringes, on the
Yes.
outer skirts of wherever.
And even
Yeah.
then you're hunted, you know? Praetor Rykard was known for being an inquisitor, and the Volcano Manor is filled with scarlet-rotted Elbenorics, it's filled with omens, it's filled with their omen killers, you know? It's not a good place to be, and you don't get away because everywhere in the lands between is ruled, except for the Eternal Cities by the end. And even the nameless Eternal City was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I say the nameless Eternal City was destroyed, but I say that in the sense that it was destroyed far before the other Eternal Cities, to the point
Yeah.
where its name was forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I gotcha. So, all right. So we start in the Age of the Ageless. I mean, in the Age of the Ancients. We got the theory that Placidusix, was probably the start of the two fingers and the three fingers when the Elden Beast crashes into Fair Missoula. So I guess kind of following that comes the age of the air tree and the glimpses into the primordial currents. So I don't know if you want to explain that a little bit.
yeah, I guess we should start with the birth of the Erd Tree, you know, because it's essentially, there's this quote that says that the Erd Tree was born in an age of warfare, you know, like where Godfrey was lord of the battlefield.
Wait, I guess just to clear this up, for me, because I'm learning, some of the pockets of the lore, just as our listeners are. But the age of the air tree and the air tree being born is after America's already, you know, become the vessel for that, correct?
Yes, it is.
So yeah, so now that we've covered the age of the ancients, how does that transition into the age of the air tree and America? And I kind of feel like where we come into the game. Actually, I guess we come in a little bit after that. But anyways, how does it transition?
Well, you know, you're sort of right and you're wrong because the Tarnished are actually very important right from the get-go at the beginning of the Age of the Erd Tree. But they don't actually do anything, at least from the player character's perspective, until way after in the Shattering War. Or after the Shattering War when they have to reclaim the Elden Ring. The beginning of the beginning of the Age of the Erd Tree begins with the Greater Will, and more especially the Elden Beast. Something that I think is very important to the lore and that is very understated is that there's a spell, one of the primeval sorceries called Founding Rain of Stars, and it's found in the mountaintop of giants, where the astrologers made their home next to the fire giants. You know, right next to like the astrologers' town. And it's past the Forbidden Lands. You know, this is a place that's beyond the ken of mortal men, that's never supposed to be touched again by people in the Golden Order that don't know the secrets, you know. This is your player committing heresy and finding out the things that were supposed to be covered up. And that's very, like, much said within the Heretic's Rise, where you find the founding Reign of Stars, where essentially the first primeval sorcerer, an ancient astrologer, peered into the primeval stream and his glimpse became reality, and that called a rain of stars down upon the land, and a hint of amber is what it says. And from that hint of amber, I speculate that that hint of amber is the creation, the birth of the greater will, because you can compare this primeval sorcerer to the essentially this customary gown of the nobles of the Altus Plateau and Landel, where it says that it was the custom of a small kingdom long ago to like, you know, dress up like the sage that founded it. And you also find the Flock Talisman somewhere on the Altus Plateau, I believe, which essentially states that there was this founder of a religion that eventually became inspired by his own people, like his own followers. You know, you can sort of imagine and speculate a story where this guy, this astrologer, he peers into the primeval stream and he creates this rain of stars that, you know, like goes across the land and scatters glintstone, but it calls the greater will too, and the greater will sends its golden star to the lands between. That might be the first birth of the sun, you know? Elden Ring and From Software likes to play with the birth and creation myth of worlds, and something very important to that is the birth of the sun. In Dark Souls 1, Gwyn is the Lord of Sunlight, and when he leaves, Gwendolyn has to create a false sun for the world in Anor Londo. That's just an illusion, you know, it's not the same. And in Elden Ring, that golden star, you know, might have been the sun that when it was forged into the Elden Ring at the birth of the Erd Tree, it made the Erd Tree essentially the sun. You know, it's why the Erd Tree's radiance is what lights up everything.
Interesting.
That was
I like that theory.
I like it a lot. I think it has. I like the idea that this primeval stage, this guy that was, he was doubtful of his own what he saw until the people that followed him, that founded a kingdom for him. It wasn't until they inspired him that he believed. But he founded that kingdom, Landel, not for himself, but for America. And that's where we really get the ball rolling. Because this is where we get into America being the Glomide Queen. And like you said, that's a very controversial topic. And I think she absolutely is. The first part of that is that the other major candidate for the Glomide Queen is Rani, and she is too young. The Godskin apostles and the Godskin nobles are spoken about in a very ancient way. They all exist either in new locations where heresy is happening or in very ancient locations where they might have originally existed. A lot of their lore is centered around things happening long ago. Even the idea of them hunting gods doesn't fit with the Golden Order because that by that time the idea of the Elden Lord and the one Empyrean with the greater will is that there is one god and one champion of that god in the Elden Lord. Before there were multiple gods, the rock goddess, the fell god, um, and the Elden Beast was probably technically a god as it was the Placidusix was its lord. But all of that changed when the Golden Order conquered everything. Like you said, the Greater Will is an imperialist concept. It brings everything under its own order so it might flourish, but there is no choice in it.
Yeah, okay. I guess
Um,
in that sense, yeah. I mean, I could kind of see the connection to the Glomite Queen, but let's break it down a little bit and get into it.
Yes, okay, so essentially, we have the two fingers existing, or the five fingers at that time, and we know that the Glomide Queen was a servant of the two fingers. She's remembered as such. So, if we understand that as Marika serving the two fingers from the very beginning, we can see the beginning of her character. Everything we know about Marika begins with her being the eternal queen of the Golden Order, but she had to fight to make that happen. And that happened with Godfrey, but who was she before she took Godfrey as her Elden Lord? Speculation on that can essentially align itself somewhat with Ronnie's storyline and Malekith and Blade and how they're similar but different. Essentially, Ronnie was raised as a step sibling with Blade. We know that from E.G.'s dialogue about Renala, someone's dialogue about Renala, I believe. And we know that Rani, in her storyline, betrays the Golden Order because she wants to bring about something new. She finds a flaw in it and she wants to break it down.
Yeah, she has
And
no
in that
interest in
way,
being an Empyrean like at all,
exactly.
which makes
Um,
sense to me. Like I can definitely see that where she's coming from and not wanting to be a part of something like that.
I think a very powerful part of Ronnie's storyline is that she has good intentions and powerful motivations, but in the end, she is sort of naive, you know? She wants to end Marika's will because she thinks Marika has done bad things, but what does it mean to bring about the Age of Stars? Like, who will suffer? Not Ronnie because she's in control of things, but like, what about everyone else when there is no more Erdtree or gentle radiance and it's just the long, cold dark? It's sort of like the Age of Dark ending. Like, yeah, sure, you have to people succumb to it, but maybe it has to happen. That's sort
Yeah.
of up to your own decision.
I mean, at this point, I guess, or at least when Ronnie's making her decisions, Malekith has sealed destined death, and I feel like she's maybe trying to return things back to some like a somewhat normal state. At least that's what I got out of it. And I guess this is speculation, but maybe some of those people that were pushed on the fringes, be able to come back. Like maybe the Age of Stars is the Age of Stars, but it's not necessarily an imperialistic thing like the Golden Order is or the Greater Will. Um, I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I think no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Something significant about the prehistory is that was when the true storm raged, because that was when Placidusix ruled the world, and the ancient dragons and their endless storm. But beyond the storm was the stars, which is how the primeval sage once peered into the, primeval current. For there to be no storm anymore means that when the Golden Order ends, there can be a true age of stars if nothing else interferes with that. But one of the ideas is that like power vacuums. If something can take power, then it might. So if Rani were to make her Age of Stars and Nicola would have still exist. What would Nicola do about that? What would Maud do about that? That's something to consider, I think.
I get where you're going with
Because you're right, it's not imperialistic. But when it's not imperialistic, it doesn't have any strength to defend itself, so no order is upheld, which I think is one of the defenses of there being an Elden Lord.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense to me. I think that's a strong argument for it to be around. I guess where did we leave off? So you were talking about America and maybe like who she was before Godfrey and kind of introducing Godfrey into the situation.
Yes, so essentially, America as a servant to the Two Fingers, who has always been a servant to the Two Fingers, mirrors Rani in the sense that she was most likely raised among with a step sibling and Empyrean shadow in the form of Malekith. In his very arena, we see a young girl surrounded by wolves or beastmen, like statues, and I think that's supposed to show America being taken in by the beastmen. And in the same way that Rani and the Knight of the Black Knives betrays the Golden Order by, killing all of the demigods across the land, and most of all Prince Godwyn, America will eventually betray the ancient dragons and the beastmen at Farum Azula by, creating her godskin apostles and then going on her god hunt.
I was just thinking about, your argument of there being a greater will and like Ronnie being slightly naive, and it's like they both are making sacrifices to make, what they believe in, like come. I don't want to use say come true, but essentially like that's what it is. Like they're both willing to make sacrifices to 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 bring that about. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just like now that you say it, I was just like comparing their two stories, and it's like I was just thinking about Godwin and the fact that Ronnie's like, okay with sending the Black Knives out to get him, and then America's, okay with betraying the greater. Like it's interesting to me that to bring about the age of whatever it is you're trying to bring about involves, betrayal and sacrifice. I just picked up on that.
And that's a really good way to describe it, sacrifice. America has to sacrifice the gods to her cause. She has to kill them all so that she might become the one god for the Golden Order. And, she sacrifices so much. Even Placidusic sacrifices part of himself as he cleanses away parts. Well, the Two Fingers and Five Fingers do, if you believe that's Placidusic's or not. I'm somewhat convinced after the Reddit post, to be honest, however crackpot the theory is. But if you believe, like, even that has to sacrifice because the Three Fingers are entombed beneath Lendl. They're supposed to be entombed forever. Like, the Golden Order was not meant to fail. It was supposed to be immortal, unending, and perfect. It was supposed to match what Placidusix had, and I think that's one of the tragedies of it. America sacrifices so much to create it. After the birth of the Erd Tree, she even has to go on this imperialist war where she just kills all of the giants for almost no reason. And it was pointless in the end. It's tragic. So, like, what then does Ronnie think about how her story ends? Like, she goes through everything she does to make the Age of Stars, and we don't see what happens after that. But how does she feel? How did Marika feel when she realized that the flames of the fell god would never die and that the Erd tree would always be vulnerable?
Yeah, that's wild. I'm just like trying to process it all now, and yeah, that was one of the things that led me to, I don't want to say like dislike America, but yeah, the whole imperialist thing, and then yeah, like killing all the giants as to protect the air tree. Like I guess maybe I'm being naive here, but I'm curious to find out like could she have negotiated with them, or that's the thing, is because they worshipped another god. That's what put the air tree at risk. It wasn't necessarily the flame itself, but it was the fact that they worship the fellow god, and like Melania said, Melina said, I mean, I forget the exact quote that she would use, but it was basically like get with it or get pushed to the fringes of society. And in that case, the fringes was death.
They just put them all to the sword because they couldn't follow with the Golden Order and their flame was too powerful. But in, an ironic twist of fate, their flame becomes embedded within the Golden Order's philosophy, even to the extent that certain prophets of the Golden Order and clerics, all their divining prophecies, they can find, incantations like catch flame. And in that description, it says that it's heretical and that they're usually banished because it's, it's the prophecy that the Erd tree can burn. It's the belief, and that's embedded within the root of the Erd tree. And I think part of that is, I think this is somewhat speculation, and it draws a little from Dark Souls 2's story, but essentially, well, Dark Souls in general, the primordial part of the soul is the flame. Um, and in Dark Souls 3, you learn that the primordial part of the human soul is the black flame. So within Elden Ring, essentially the Erd tree's primordial form was the Crucible, and that failure is in some way linked to the Giants, because the Crucible, the Giants, and Placidusix all have some vague connection to the Frenzied concept, with the idea that the 3 fingers were cut off from the 5 fingers, purified, and they were entombed beneath Lame-Dole, and they would over time become frenzied. But it was the containing of the power of the frenzied flame, the crucible of life, and the stealing of that energy to make the Erd tree possible. Like, it's enrooted right at the concept of it, but it's sealed away to make it safe, and then doubly sealed by making destined death impossible. It's like there's so many layers to make it. I don't know.
It's definitely like it's definitely blowing my mind a little bit. Like I'm seeing the pieces fit together.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
for doubters, I think the biggest example is the Sanctuary Stone and the Frenzied Flamestone. Essentially, they're both rocks blown off of Farum Azula, which I think Farum Azula in and of itself might, like, the concepts, Elden Ring takes a lot in its concept from Norse mythology and Irish mythology, which intertwine themselves. That's where, like, like you get stuff like them saying Leal Hound or Godfrey's death painting in the intro looking like Cuchulain's death scene in Irish mythology. Or like the Erd tree itself is, the frickin' Yggdrasil. But something about the ancient dragons is that when they're made of stone, and the beastmen would bury themselves. Essentially, one of their death practices, getting back to death, is that they would put themselves in the stone. If you look around Farum Azula, and also the Beast Sanctum, which is a preserved part of like the Beastmen's architecture, given the Geraint as a reward for his service, I'm assuming. You can see how the Beastmen skeletons are literally embedded in stone, probably because they're trying to mirror how, like, their gods, the ancient dragons, die as they turn to gravel stone. Yeah, I just went off on a tangent.
No, it's so good. It's like I mean I knew that about Grank already, so I was just letting you finishing the thought. But yeah, the ideas are really good. And I guess I'm just trying to one thing that I never connected was the fact that all of those things went into making the air tree possible. I'm thinking about it in the sense of just Elden Ring, and then I'm also thinking about it in like the sense of the world and like where that might have been drawn from. I don't really have any like solid conclusions to share about it, but like my brain is definitely like the wheels are turning where it's like I don't know, that's just an interesting concept where like Marika tries to so she kills the giants, but the flame of the fell god is kind of embedded in the idea of the air tree, and then the fact that the 3 fingers are banished literally right beneath it is it just is incredibly interesting to me, especially due to the fact that the burial watchdogs and all those tombs where all of the people that die there or get placed in those tombs go back up into the air tree. I don't know, I'm trying to picture it all and like the cycle and flow of what's going on, and I have no solid conclusions drawn, but it's definitely got me thinking, and I like hearing this.
Yeah, that's my favorite thing about Elden Ring. It just, in every single part of it, it gets you thinking. If I could just segue, I had some absolutely like crackpot, like Vike posting level theories when I first played the game. I thought that there was going to be a big theme about metal because the Tarnished is like a concept of like metal and Godric's grafting and the Elden Ring being a metal thing, which obviously wasn't
Interesting.
involved at all. I thought that there was going to be some story about like how the minor Erd trees and the Erd tree were all born from the same thing, and the Erd tree was only special because it was alive the longest, and that it needed to die so that the other ones could flourish, which is completely wrong.
Yeah.
Um, I had all sorts of ideas running through my head until I finalized on this after I replayed, a couple new game cycles and like did the other quests. One of my major things with the primordial flame and the crucible and how it links back to the greater will and the Erde tree and how it's all linked together, I think, is from the frenzied flame ending. It desires to burn everything back together by creating the Lord of the Frenzied Flame. But what is the Lord of the Frenzied Flame? Like when Melina says that the Lord of the Frenzied Flame is no lord at all because it's a lord of nothing alive,
Yeah,
like
it's just
that's
burning. It's burning with
exactly.
everything else. It's all burning.
But
It's all burning.
and the tarnished is burning too. Like
Hmm.
what have you burned into at that point? The frenzied flame drives people mad, and you've become just a single glowing circle of it. A circle that looks very reminiscent of the rune symbol, which, if we know the greater will to be linked with anything in the game, it's going to be runes. I think that there's something fascinating about the idea that you have to take this power, this frenzied flame from the three fingers, like their blessing, and it stays within you. It's burning and churning and like destroying you internally, and you can see that in the player's eyes and the incantations that they can cast. But it's not until you defeat the Elden Beast and Radagon and the resistance within the Erde tree, and you sort of cause this, you reunite the two powers. The greater will is probably housed within Marika, and you now have the frenzied flame aspect within yourself. So when those two concepts reunite, that's when you become the true lord of the frenzied flame. And I think that's it's one of like the truly fascinating things, parts of like it's one of the really cool parts of the ending.
It for sure was my favorite ending. But do you think, and this could just be crackpot again, I'm not a lore expert by any means, but do you think that is a symbolic idea of the reuniting of the five fingers? Or now I'm like really thinking, because Age of Stars, Golden Order.
I mean, no, I actually do think so. I think that
Wait.
the
I
being you become at the end is go on.
So if we think about the five fingers, like let's just think about what they could be, right? So you have like the Age of Stars, the Frenzied Flame, Destined Death, the Golden Order, and the Greater Will. That makes like five, separate things. So when you like, does that make sense at all?
Um, for a while, I tried tying the two fingers and the three fingers to different concepts. Like the primordial flame is definitely one. The greater will would probably be one. Um, the concepts of inner and outer order are sort of important, and they're sort of represented through like glints. They're represented through glintstone, through the scarlet rot, somewhat in the frenzied flame. The stuff about blood might be a new concept from the Golden Order. Like, I think that might, like, Mikola might
Oh,
legit be the god of blood. I have no idea. Because there's no other reference. That's
I don't.
another
I
thing.
wouldn't think so, but
I don't think so. I don't know. It's like, the
I
Formless
think
Mother is
I
just
think Mikola
someone, I guess.
takes like. Well, yeah, that's the thing. I think Mikola takes like many, like multiple forms, like possibly,
Well,
or like has many
that's where
bodies.
my theory builds off of. It's essentially, Mikola has their child self, but then they also have Saint Trina, and Saint Trina goes by many forms in and of himself. But then we see Mikola in a rebirthing cocoon, and we know that in cocoons, people become, like the entire body is melted down. So that's sort of my idea. Like the formless mother literally means formless because they are, you know.
That makes sense. Okay, well, we can get back to what we had. Maybe I just had a crackpot theory, but I guess my original question before I had the crackpot theory was more or less, you were talking about Radagon and the Greater Will, and then when you get the frenzied flame ending, I guess my question around that was, do you think that's them like rejoining each other? And then that's after that, I was like thinking about Destined Death, and I was like, wait, maybe it's all like coming back together, but.
I mean, I think it is. I think that's it's a very true concept. It's there's essentially two different main ending types. You can become the Elden Lord, or you can choose to destroy the Golden Order either through using Rani's help or through using the Frenzied Flame. And in both instances of those, the Golden Order is only truly destroyed when Marika is destroyed. in Ronnie's instance, she picks up Marika's head, and the head turns into those, glowing golden runes that are so reminiscent of the Greater Will's power, probably the Greater Will itself perishing in that moment, or at least being banished in some way. I think it's a pretty final thing that Ronnie does to it. But in the case of the frenzied flame, it's your character being overwhelmed by the frenzied power, and they collapse in front of Marika's Empyrean form, and then uh, Marika's head shatters, and you rise as the frenzied flame, like the Lord of the frenzied flame. And that's part of why I agree with you. It's like it's a reunification of those two concepts. That might have been how the Greater Will was when it was first formed, and it wasn't until it sort of changed itself, possibly.
I just realized something, and that is that, and no fault of ours because it's such an interesting topic, but we've been explaining all of this as if everyone knows what we're talking about, and we kind of skipped some of what happened. Like I don't even think we ever reached the point to like where we joined the game or where the shattering happened and all that. So do we want to like take a step back and cover the ground of some
Yeah,
of that
let's
stuff as
circle
well?
back. I think, just like how the Greater Will makes a cycle of rebirth and death, we go from the beginning of the game to the end, and with
That works for me.
um, so I think circling back, we can do it best with Godfrey. Essentially, Marika, at the end of her being the Gloam-eyed Queen, and leading the Godskin Apostles and sort of creating the first breaks in the ancient dragon's order of many gods under the True Storm, she's defeated by Malekith. And rather than slaying her or taking her captive, Malekith joins her. He takes the power of destined death within his own blade, and he chooses to serve her. Blade betrays the order that he serves by, going with Rani, and it's the same thing with Malekith. Except, I guess Malekith might be betraying a different master in Placidusix, but everything loops back to the Greater Will, and the Greater Will makes a circle. It's sort of a dick. So after Malekith spares Marika, together they both go to what most likely the Round Table hold in Landel, and that's where they meet up with Horalu. Um, so Horalu was the chieftain of the Northern Badlands. He was chosen by the Two Fingers, by Marika, on the sole idea of how powerful he was as a warrior. There was no other thing. And when he swore to become Lord, the Elden Lord of the New World, he took on a new name, Godfrey of the Golden Order, and he took the Beast Regent Serash upon his back so that Serash might, restrain his battle lust and make him act in an accordingly lordly manner.
Oh, keep going.
I will. Okay. So yeah, Godfrey is now, he's now married to Marika. He's sworn to become Elden
Wait,
Lord.
I just
Huh?
thought of something. Somehow we have to put the story of Elden Ring into like a child's like book, and then we can like read it to our kids when we go to bed or when they go to bed.
Oh, we should have.
Sorry, I was just like when I was telling you to keep going, like that just popped in my head where I was like, the story's so good, like I want to hear more. It's like, oh, I could maybe read the story of the Air Tree and the Golden Order to my kids when they go to sleep.
No, it was a good interruption. Just turn back some of the violence and depressing stuff. You got a pretty entertaining story. Kids and all ages.
Yeah, it could definitely become a classic book to read at night. But all right, I'll let you get back to it.
So yeah, Godfrey is the first Elden Lord, but he's also the first Tarnished, as we know from the intro painting and from him as the final boss. He's Horalu, he's a Tarnished, just like us. And in that way, his warriors are the Tarnished. All of the Tarnished was a warrior once because they served Godfrey in the war to create the Golden Order. They were in the original army. They would fight with him even to the point where he was banished from the Golden Order when he won all of his wars. But it would surely begin, um, circling back to the ancestral spirit and how it creates buds. The Erda tree was once a bud, but it had the powers of the Greater Will, the Elden Ring, and everything grafted onto it in some way. It was combined with It's hard to fully explain. Um, this actually gets into somewhat of a controversial thing. I think that was started by Vidya when he's like put his great tree theory forward, which is essentially the great tree is mentioned in 3 different item descriptions, and it most likely doesn't exist. It's probably just the Erd tree. But upon further examination, I'm gonna put the YouTuber or whatever post I found down below if I can find it. But it essentially states that when examining the translation, it's probably stating that the Great Tree existed, and then when the Elden Ring was forged, it became the Erde Tree. It was a bud that had something grafted onto it. And that can be sort of compared to what we know of the Halig tree, which was a bud that was then watered by Miquella's blood, and that made it into the Halig tree eventually.
Which was supposed to be like a separate air tree in and of itself, correct? It was just going to be an air tree free of the Greater Will or the Golden Ore. I forget where I got this from.
Yeah,
Is
so
that
essentially, right down to the name of it, essentially, the Erde tree, Miquella's theory on the Erde tree is that the Erde tree is what would become the center of the Golden Order's worship, but because it was a flawed existence, because it was doomed to someday die, that would invite the Scarlet Rot and the Curse of the Omens and the issues with undeath and rebirth into the Order, and that would like eventually destroy the Order. And that was Miquella's fear. So what he thought he could do was that he could become the new Empyrean god of the Golden Order, but he would replace the Erde tree with his own Halig tree. Erde tree, the prefix Erd means world, but Halig, that prefix means holy. So he has this idea that the Halig tree will no longer have any other idea than it have any other purpose than to be symbolic of the protection of the Golden Order, and to follow that, he makes it a sort of holy land for like you know doomed peoples like the Misbegotten or the Elbenorics.
I think that was like a fairly noble pursuit.
Yeah, I think Miquella's a really fascinating character. Him and Ronnie, I think, are sort of like the dual examinations of, like essentially building off of what Goldmask thinks of the Golden Order. The major issues that come about from its downfall are that the gods could not decide on inner or outer order, and that's exemplified in Marika being both, herself and Radagon. As Marika, she made champions of the inner order like Godwyn that would, defend it. But then she also, as Radagon, made dissidents of the outer order like Rykard, Radahn, and Rani that would eventually, their wars and plotting and scheming would like introduce the cracks that began the Shadow.
Well, and I think part of it is because America saw the faults in it herself, and
I think
that's
she
what that's.
even
Oh yeah.
I think she even felt the faults in it, She was a shattered person. She felt that she
Well,
had the greater will in Elden Ring in within herself a lot of the time. So she might have been beholden to a lot of that pain and suffering.
yeah, that's why I raised the question earlier, like when Radagon came in, or when they became merged, because I guess like it's an interesting concept to think like, I don't know. Part of me thinks like everything was fine at first, and it's just America, and then maybe she notices some issues and some flaws in what's going on, and then she develops this other personality. Part of me thinks that America was completely aligned with the greater will and everything was fine, and then she meets Radagon, and then like Radagon infiltrates, her mind and what's going on, and then like some of the more positives, you know what I'm saying? Like yeah, sorry, I'm gonna try to clear this up a little bit easier. In my head, which I have, I don't necessarily have anything to back this up either way, but there's three things. Like they exist at the same time the whole time, and Marika just has these two parts of her, and she's trying to deal with that. And what you just mentioned is how she deals with it. They're dealing with the outer and inner order. Part of me thinks that Marika's all fine with the greater will and is like in it full force, and at some point between Godfrey leaving and or sorry, I should have written these thoughts down, but I don't know if you know where I'm going with this, but that's why I found that such an interesting topic, because at what point
At
did
what point did
she
they become the same person?
Well,
I'm
yeah,
curious.
and I think part of it reflects like some of the decisions that were made along her storyline. Where
I
like I
would
feel like
agree a
that.
lot with that.
Yeah, cool. I wish I could clean those thoughts up, but I really can't because they're not full thoughts. They're just kind of general speculations that have crossed my mind, and I've been like, oh, well, it could be this way, and like, oh, it could be that way, and that's why I raised the question at the beginning of the podcast, like, what your thoughts are on it, because I feel like that is the most unclear thing in the entire game. Which you're right, like America's a pivotal force in the entire lands between, and so depending on how you look at it and her influence and influences, like it just really determines how you look at the entire storyline of the game.
Yeah, I think it's like I said, it's pivotal. And that is something I wondered for a very long time. And I know that it's something a lot of people have put theories forward on. And my take on it is that essentially America, if we want to back it up to the linear timeline, then the Erd Tree is born. Godfrey and his host of warriors, under the blessing of the Erd Tree's radiance, put the giants to the sword, and they also rout the ancient dragons. But it's said that the Age of Plenty that followed the Erd Tree's birth did not last for long. Its blessings soon dimmed. Um, its teardrops turned to crystals, and like its sap turned to amber and whatnot. And after that, I think is when the wars against Liurnia and other humans started. There's this quote that you can find on the giant crusher hammer that says that man grew weak when they turned upon like their fellows. And I think that's reflected in how the Liurnian war was against like the scholars of Raya Lucaria and the people that followed them, and possibly the Elbenorics that lived there. It's not like giants. It's not other beings. It's like dragons or the beastmen. It's just humans. And you can even see how humans have grown smaller since Godfrey's days. I mean, Godfrey is the buff Elden Lord with the probably one of the most powerful like runes ever, is obviously probably going to be bigger than most people, but I feel like there's something to be said for, I don't know, humans growing weaker with time. And that being reflected with the transition from the Age of Plenty to the rest of the Age of the Erd Tree, and especially again with the transition from the Age of the Erd Tree to just like the Age of the Golden Order. Everything was simplified and put under one order. Anyway, that was a tangent again. Being linear with it, when Godfrey conquers Liurnia, they might have. I think that that was when a lot of people were experiencing their first doubts in the Golden Order. They had sacrificed part of the two fingers. They had put the giants to the sword. And what was it for? For the Erdtree to just dim? For their power to just not be as much as it was? So for America to have her personality be one of sort of peace and like trying to help people, but also being of someone that knows how to like fight, I think there's a strong argument for that to transition into Radagon. Like, for an Empyrean to disobey the two fingers, they can impose their will, but to disobey too much, what if that were to split your mind entirely into a persona completely loyal to the two fingers? And if the mandate was that you conquer the rest of the lands between, it makes sense that Radagon would make his first appearance in the First Liurnian War as the champion that like lit up the battlefield and fought the fiercest, you know?
That's that's a conclusion that I've kind of come to settle on. Is that, yeah, I feel like he's almost created as like a dual personality. Like I don't want to, like, almost like due to guilt or something.
Yeah, it's like one of the things that's in the Scar Seals and the Sore Seals description is that duty can be a blessing, but the gift of duty over time can turn into a burden. So America, maybe by that time of invading Liurnia, her duty had become a burden. So the greater will, it split her persona. And Radagon, for a while, he too was loyal. But even then, he too felt the burden of duty over time. And maybe that's why he went mad and like, maybe that's why he's locked away the Erdtree. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a tough one to really draw like a full 100% conclusion on, because you could talk about it for days and you would never fully, understand exactly. I feel like there, I feel like it was a solid decision on FromSoft's part to mystify that portion of the plot line because it just is really left with a lot of unanswered questions, and you could speculate on different points of view on it for any amount of time and not really ever feel completely or at least I don't know about you, but I would never feel completely 100% on whatever theory I'd come up with, at least when it comes to the America and Radagon situation.
Yeah, I feel like in my mind I like to accept all of the theories as possible, and it's just the idea that I've thought through them in my head that I enjoy. It's why I sort of indulge in a lot of more crackpot theories. Like when I first played Elden Ring, I was pretty firmly like, yeah, this probably isn't none of the worlds that the games make are related. But after playing it, at some point I ended up being like, well, the Golden Pillars and the Elden Beast's boss room are at the very bottom of the world if you jump down the center of the Erde tree after clipping into it, based off of Zuli's video. And we know that the arch trees that you see in Dark Souls are at the bottom of the world, so maybe over time, if Dark Souls 1 was the beginning, then the fire that the first flame became the primordial flame that the giants had and that was stolen to make the Erd tree, and that the Age of Ancients began again after the duel at the end of the world, and it's all sorts of bullshit you can imagine. Like the
Well,
Hunter's Dream has those big pillars, and that's why you see them. That's why they're comparable to the Elden Beast's boss room.
yeah,
It's the same world.
I think it is all somewhat interconnected, and you see in the plot lines in all of the games that they hold like such levels of similarity, and like you almost said it like lazily, like it was like, well, this is this and this is that, and it's like, but the thing is, like, you're probably not wrong. Like, based on the idea of Dark Souls and where it ended in Dark Souls 3, like, someone could be like, it's definitely not connected. It's totally different. It's like they basically say that this is going to go on for eternity. And, like, what we're seeing now might be, like, who knows how many eternities later, in a sense. It's like, it still seems like the same ideas are there. You might see different names and different symbols, but the ideas remain the same. And so to me it makes sense. Like I don't find it such a crackpot theory to think that all of their universes seem parallel, and I don't think of them like parallel side by side. It could be parallel side by side, or it could be like parallel in time, almost, like depending on how you think of it. But there's just such similarities that I don't think it's such a crackpot conclusion to draw, in my opinion.
No, I mean, that's fair enough. The flow of time is convoluted in Mordran, and in the gutter in Dark Souls 2, you can find images of crumpled up beer cans because it's the center place of all trash in the universe. So maybe we're in there too. Maybe the Greater Will and Radagons can suck up there.
Quick side note before we go back into it, and we should promise no more tangents next time. But I'm thinking of down in Nokron, there are those statues. Are those the statues that you were referring to that are like super similar to what's in Bloodborne? It's like the kind of like long faces like crawling up there, and they're stone. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Oh yeah, the ones that sacrificed themselves. They look like the imagery that's used in Yahar'gul, right?
Yes. Yep. Exactly that. That's
Um,
what I'm thinking of.
I think there's a possibility that it was a reused asset in some way. Like the texture and model was made so they could easily convert
It
it. But
it, it 100% was a reused asset, but I guess the only reason I brought it up is like if you're gonna reuse the asset, like okay, so obviously you're gonna reuse assets, if you're a developing company. But I just meant like I'm not saying they're necessarily connected in their worlds, but if you're gonna reuse assets like that, you might reuse concepts. Because I feel like FromSoft very much has certain themes that kind of flow through like almost all of their games.
yeah, you're absolutely right. I think what's going on there is that in Yahar'gul, everyone there is sacrificing themselves to either make the one reborn, which is the mortal attempt to create their own old one or something like that. And to do it, they take like the flesh and souls of people and blood echoes and combine them in this disgusting mass. But beyond that, they're also trying to do the Mensis ritual and create the nightmare of Mensis. While in Nokron, what they're doing is they're sacrificing themselves to create the Fingerslayer blade in like a last act of contempt towards the greater will, so that someone might be able to go kill the two fingers eventually.
Wow, yeah, no, I had not thought that deeply into it, but that makes sense.
I guess getting
Sorry.
back.
Yeah, I was
Oh,
gonna say sorry for the tangent, and then getting
no,
back,
I love the tangents. I think that's what's fun about doing a lore episode. We dig into every nook and cranny and
and then we get stuck there for eternity.
getting back to Godfrey, I think something really important about Marika and her concepts of the fight with inner and outer order is, like I was saying, Mikola and Rani are like the champions of the possible goddesses that can replace Marika eventually, that are born for both concepts. Mikola wants to create his unalloyed gold perfect order, and Rani wants to destroy it entirely because outer order wants to can keep going, fractaling forever, and then I feel like inner order follows the idea of fundamentalism. They guard against both concepts. They want to keep the straight line. Like if you look at the Elden Ring itself, it's these interlinking like circles that are around a straight line going down the middle. And that line represents the golden lineage, while the circles represent the great runes pillaged from the dead gods taken during the Golden Order's conquest of the world, Uh, I remember I posted on Reddit, there's like this theory about where all of the shard bearers got their great runes and how it affected them. I thought that Rodan's was the fell gods, and that's why he was able to burn it to resist the scarlet rot, and it's partly why he grew so large. Rykard obviously took the great serpents, which we know was hunted long ago and killed, so its great rune was probably taken and put into the Elden Ring. Um, Godric's and Morgits, those could go either way, but one of them is probably Placidusix's. I would say that would be Godric, since it's like the one that everything else graphs onto. While the other one that Morgits gets, it's probably Godfrey's great rune that when he was divested of grace was taken back, and given to I don't know, put into the Elden Ring, I guess, to the next Elden Lord. Um, it's
Speculative.
so when they what was that?
Oh, you said it's. I thought you were gonna say speculative.
Yes, it's very speculative. There's so many different concepts and things going on to look into. It's hard to come to a full conclusion. I think the best way to honestly get into any lore of the FromSoft games is like a narrated playthrough, because so much of it depends on enemy locations, what the enemies are doing, where the items are found, what they're doing in the boss fights. Like, get rid of video essays and just discussing it. It's like give a narrated playthrough. I think that's the 100% way. That's tangential.
Stay tuned for Gideon's narrated playthrough.
Yeah, I'll be Twitch streaming, obviously. So yeah, I think something very important about Radagon that can possibly be important is that Godfrey, he's essentially supposed to be the undefeated Elden Lord, but at the end of his campaign, he's banished, and Radagon takes his place. But in the meantime of Radagon being the champion of his army, being a champion in his army, when they get stalled out in Liurnia, they don't lose or win, they make peace. And in making peace, Radagon marries Renala, and he anoints himself with Celestial Dew, which Celestial Dew essentially absolves one of sin, and it resets bonds. And I feel like this could possibly be the beginning of an escape from the greater will. We know that Radagon if Radagon was born of Marika's disobedience to the two fingers, then maybe when he was used at first as like a loyal puppet, but then he had the celestial dew put on him, and that might have freed him from the greater will's influence, so that he could then join Renala in her working of outer order. Which, mentioning Renala, it's sort of cool if you look at her in her second phase of her boss fight. She's doing the outer order pose as her default stance, sort of like she's the queen of the full moon. Well, she's the full moon witch. Uh,
And or I guess one of the theories that I had seen and also kind of thought so you have her first phase and she seems pretty easy to defeat, which I think at some point I forget what items or which characters mention that she was only placed there because she learned of the full moon. Like it wasn't there wasn't a lot of reason to put her in the position that she was in, and that then you hear Ronnie's voice and that her entire second phase is like it's Ronnie summoning her, like it's a summons version of her. Is like one of the theories that I had heard. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm trying to think of it. If I'm gonna be honest, Renala's boss fight has haunted me because it is probably outside of Mog's boss fight, one of the most complex ones that can be broken down to mean various things. Because it's, you have this concept of Renala, who has
Spirit
gone
summons.
mad with the Amber Egg and has the Great Rune of the Unborn within it, and that was a gift from Radagon to her. So it's like, from the very beginning, you have to be like, what drove Renala mad? Was it depression from Radagon leaving? Was it her trying to use the Great Rune of Unbirth or Rebirth or whatever to rebirth herself as a possible Empyrean, which might have been her and Radagon's plan? Um, or because she wanted to make an Age of Stars too. I feel like Ronnie inherits her plot. And then the third option is that if Renala was made powerful by the full moon, if you look at her remembrance, it's the remembrance of the full moon witch. It's the full moon part that's important about her character, and it's that full moon that bewitched the academy, allowing her to become queen. But if the
Exactly.
full moon abandons her to choose Ronnie, then maybe that's what drove her mad. Maybe it was nothing to
Yes.
do with the Golden Order.
Yes, and that's what I was trying to mention. So I'm completely on board with what you had just mentioned. So the full moon betrays her for Ronnie, but then Ronnie goes to protect her. Where like when you are going through her first phase, specifically her second phase, that's a spirit summons of sorts that Ronnie has casted to like help protect her, because after you defeat that version of her, you end up in the room and she's still there. Like you didn't finish her off, you didn't end that fight. And the reason is that you were fighting a spirit summons, and I think that's pretty interesting because then that spirit summons other spirits as well. And I think that's like a testament to Ronnie's power and Ronnie's will to bring back the Age of Stars. That's what I was trying to get at just a minute ago.
No, I think if I may be allowed a moment of speculation, I think that breaking down Renala's boss fight, you have Renala gone mad from being abandoned by her full moon, by losing her power. So she just clutches this amber egg and endlessly rebirths everyone that comes near her because, she's just, she's mad. She's obsessed. She's lost everything she attempted to do. So now she just does the last thing she tried over and over. So when the Tarnished, in somewhat in self-defense, fights her down and she's crawling away, it triggers something. Ronnie learns about it, and like he does say, she does like some sort of spirit summons on Renala. And I think that there's a possibility that what she does is that she rebirths Renala. Renala is known for all of her rebirthing is sickly and unformed. All of the people in her boss room are probably the unwary like academy people that didn't get away from her in time, that just got rebirthed endlessly until they were no longer even like what they were before. But if Rani has the true power of it, she might rebirth her mother so that her mother can fight you as she was in her prime. And I think that's something that's repeated with the Elden Beast fight and Ram the Vacuous Spider in Bloodborne, is that there's this symbolism of a higher plane, like that's tied to this idea of a lake and a body of water. So fighting Renala in this body of water, where all you see is her god behind her, the full moon. It's like you're fighting a mental reborn version of her, and that at the end of it, the reason that she's passive is because you've pacified her. You've cleansed her of the whatever demons haunted her. And that sort of happens again with Morgoth's boss fight. It's sort of where I got the idea from, the idea that you cleanse him of his omen horns when you win the fight against him, you know? We interrupt your irregularly scheduled broadcast for these breaking announcements. The infamous Dung Eater was seen prowling the Laneville alleyways earlier this afternoon and has been apprehended by the city guard. Going live at the Gelmir battlefield where our glorious veiled king Morgott combats the blasphemous Prider Rykard, we regret to announce yet another stalemate fought in the Ashen Hills. However, Rykard himself has quit the field, retreating to the Volcano Manor to commune with his Great Serpent. Now, I don't know what he calls it, but that's just what I call a night to myself. We'll be right back after these messages.
Do you feel overlooked after the shattering? Are you a tarnished simply looking to make your way in the lands between? Does your ambition feel spurned? All of these are important questions when considering Landell's latest election for Elden Lord. Our King Morgott proved himself defending the city in its second defense, but what has he really done for the people of the lands between? Is he really the right monarch for you? Misery and curses spread unending through the populace, but all he cares about is the 1% living in the air tree. By the way, he's gone on record for saying some pretty dodgy stuff about the Tarnished. You should vote for a Lord Contender who has the people's wishes at heart, a man who embraced the flame within his own heart. The most beloved, you all know him as Vike the Dragon Spear, brought to you by Great Caravan Incorporated.
An update on the Dung Eater situation. After being imprisoned, he promptly went on a rampage of wanton violence, ending with the debasing and defiling of over 50 corpses of his other prisoners. He has been summarily executed in the city square. May he rot in pieces. More as the situation develops.
On behalf of the Sanguine Noble Committee, we would like to take a moment to mourn the loss of Rivers of Blood. May ROB spam be remembered as disdainfully as the Meta Cheese was praised. I know that I will and will not miss it, but I will miss you when it comes to the Elden Beast.
A final update on the loathsome Dung Eater. He was spontaneously re-granted the gift of grace and has ransacked the Landel City Square. After much bloodshed, the city guard has thrown his corpse into the sewer jail, knowing he will soon revive. Let his name be forgotten in the coming Shattering War.
Before we get right back into it, so I guess not only is that a testament to your skill in finding the story and doing the research and putting it all together, but it's also a skill in FromSoft to put a story together that actually makes a full grown adult kind of feel like a kid, like he's listening to an old fantasy story about an old kingdom. It's really cool.
I think it's definitely a testament to how good they are at making things.
It's that George R.R. Martin dude. He pulled through and creating a nice history.
Yeah, I think he made a lot of the stuff with I think a lot of the complex interplay between Ronnie and the twins and Morgott and Rykard that made a really solid base for a lot of the lore to play around, and that's it's what makes part of it so interesting, because you see all these bosses and people in the lore. They all have their own take on duty, and they all fight for different reasons. So it's not very black and white, and it's just enthralling instead.
Yeah. Not only is it not black and white, but it's not right and wrong either. There's right and wrong to each of their stories, where they're fighting for certain things, and then they're in the fight to make a certain idea a reality, you end up killing other ideas or other realities. And it's an interesting thing where it's none of the ideas or realities are necessarily right or wrong, but there are really good parts to them, and then there are also these sacrifices and negative parts to them that really pull through. It's interesting.
In opening one door, you close 10 more.
Yeah, at work we call it the unintended consequences. So if we're trying to solve a problem or something, I might be oh, this is the answer to that problem, but then within that I never thought about the unintended consequences. And in doing so, in telling people the time they expect us to be there, the unintended consequence, then they're upset. So yeah, I think there's a lot of unintended consequences in this. It's interesting.
So I guess building off of everything talked about between Nerika, Rani, and Nicola, I think you see that clash between Golden Order, Outer Order, and Inner Order manifest itself into the Knight of the Black Knives. Essentially, all three of these characters are the wisest of their groups, and they can all see the growing fractures in the Order, but they all have different ideas about what has to happen. But at the same time, they all come together in common cause. And while I think that this is, again, speculative, I think that the game teases so much of a mystery about the Knight of the Black Knives because it wants you to really think about the conspirators behind it. You know, when I first played the game, I thought Morgott was behind it because he had golden spectral knives and he was an assassin type guy, and that was a complete red herring and totally stupid on my part. Because, you know, Rajir will straight up tell you as you start to explore the Night of the Black Knives and its consequences with death that it was Rani. But when you meet Marani, you know, she straight up admits it. And she tells you about it to some extent, but she doesn't tell you the whole of it. So it isn't until you start exploring the other secret parts of the game, until you go beyond the Forbidden Lands to Nicola's Halig tree, and you start getting the black knife lore and all of the knife prints in those blades, where you start to learn more about the people behind it. You learn that the black knives were from Newman, the same land that Marika herself was from, Newman being some sort of alternate dimension or distant land across the sea type thing. It's very mysterious.
The
But
way
these
that you
black,
said that Ronnie didn't tell you the whole of it, like it sounds like you're saying that she maybe like withheld some information.
I believe so. I think an important part of Rani's character is that she's just sort of chilling in a tower. You know, she did her part in the Night of the Black Knife. She wants the Age of Stars to come about. But at the end of it, she's sort of locked herself into a corner. You know, she lost all of her agency. She has no more allies beyond Blade, EG, and Salutis, and she can't really leave her lands because of the threat of the Tarnished and other people. You know, so she just sort of hides out, and she knows that if she were to outright straight state her intentions of destroying the Greater Will, most people would like stay away from her. So I feel like she just accepts aid. She doesn't voice her full intentions, and that comes to light when she goes into her doll form. When that begins, she says that her tongue is looser in that form, that she doesn't exactly know what she's talking about. And during that time, you know, she ponders how she's going to betray Blade, how she's going to betray Sylvanas, how she's going to betray the world itself. And then she talks about you. She doesn't say she'll betray you, but if she mimics Marika's storyline, we all know what happened to the first Elden Lord Godfrey. Like, you
Ah,
know,
yes, and that's the unspoken. That's the unspoken after ending. After if you choose the Age of Stars ending, that's the unspoken bits after that.
possibly. I think there's also a possible, you know, I think that there's a possible argument that for a long time Marika did love Godfrey. You know, I think that they loved their children, Godwyn, and then the twins, but like you say, it's the unspoken after bit. What happens 100 years after you become the Lord of your new ending? How does it all stick together? A lot of the times it might not, you know?
The other thing that I found interesting. So you say that the Black Knives come from Newman, which is the same area that America was from,
I
correct?
do indeed, yes.
And so at that point, like I guess at the beginning of the episode, we were talking about how some of what Ronnie does mirrors what America does, and I find it interesting that that is in a sense like an integration of concepts, in my opinion, where you have Ronnie in the Age of Stars, and then you have America, but then Ronnie manages to utilize, or in a sense they partner up, like not necessarily partner up, but shit. I have these half baked thoughts. My entire everything I have is a crackpot theory. But do you
No,
understand
I
where I'm
mean,
going with that?
yeah, because part of it is that Ronnie can't continue her storyline until she meets a Charnished willing to champion her cause, in the same way that Marika, after being defeated by Malekith, can't continue her storyline until getting Godfrey's help. You know,
Exactly.
it mirrors, they mirror each other. You get to know more about Marika's storyline by learning about Rani's storyline. And that goes again with Mikola. I think Rani mirrors the beginning of Marika's storyline, why she created the Erd Tree, why she turned against the ancient dragons and the beastmen of Farum Azula that raised her. I think Mikola's storyline in some ways explores what Marika did to try and preserve her golden order. Mikola wanted to create a perfect Elden Lord, and maybe Marika once thought that she could be her perfect Elden Lord. Maybe she thought that God, by the end of his campaign, had lost his faith in the Golden Order and that he was a danger to it. So she banished him. She thought that she could do it herself. But eventually she too turned on herself and I don't know. Maybe that's the tragedy of it.
The other thought process is not that she thought that he lost his view of the Golden Order, but maybe that, I guess, earlier in the episode where we were talking about the sacrifices that they have to make, and I feel like a certain amount of, well, I mean, I guess I'm calling them sacrifices, but I don't know. There's just so much bloodshed behind it that maybe it wasn't him that was not okay with it, because this guy is like, I wish I had better words put together
The
to
Lord of
explain
the
what I'm.
Battlefield.
Exactly. So he's the lord of the battlefield, and it might not be so much that she thought he lost sight of it, but that she didn't agree with it, and that kind of like mirrors like Ronnie's not wanting to be an Empyrean, where it's like maybe they made these certain sacrifices and then sort of realized that that's not what they wanted to do, and then that's where you get the shattering and these other things where like they have this goal and then certain things occur and then they're like, well, was that worth it? And that maybe is like the shattering, like the idea of this perfect world, and then it took so much bloodshed or so much whatever to get to that point. And then like the shattering could be representative of their ideas behind it, of like, was it worth it? Like that's the shattering. It's not necessarily like a physical thing, but I mean it was a physical thing because America was in control of it all. So when her mind shattered around the idea of what she was trying to achieve, then like the world around her shattered because so much of the world relied on what she was trying to create.
That's I think that's a sort of fitting way to talk about it, because part of America's mindset leading up to the shattering is really interesting. Like, you have to think about how broken someone has to be for them to literally take the very thing they swore to uphold, something they fought so hard to create, and to just break it with the hope that when it gets fixed, things will be better. It's like a leap of faith that destroys herself. Um, if you look at the intro cutscene and compared to how America and Radagon look in game, they only look that way, like where they have their right arm, or is it their left arm, where one of the arms is blown off, because that was the reverberation, that was the blowback from shattering the Elden Ring. That was what releasing its energies did to her, and she chose that. She chose that and to sacrifice all of her children and everything she made to try and make a better world because she had given up on this one. Like, like you
Yeah,
say, that yeah.
that's going to show some amount of guilt and like and it, like, to me that's like, because she had helped set all of that up. That's like wait a minute, I fucked up, and then like going to in a sense like sacrifice herself to fix it. It's like I hating what you created almost.
Yeah, like hating and loving and hating, it's just the circle for her. I think
Yeah.
so much of her quotes, I really love. I like Melina a lot as a character. I've seen people rag on her because she doesn't appear much in the game, which is sort of sad. And to me, she sort of appears a lot because I don't know, I play the game somewhat fast, but like she gives such I really love her dialogue. It's so ominous and thoughtful. There's this church outside of Landel where she gives you Marika's quote, and it talks about how Marika doesn't think that you can no longer. She thinks that the people can no longer rely on blind faith, and that they have to understand why they follow their faith. She's realized that following the greater will and the two fingers has created misery, that she should never have sealed with the three fingers, and that there are things wrong with her order. And she like knows that she has to look past that. She speaks in these vague allusions to higher concepts because she's dealing with them all internally, and like who could really understand what she's doing? People just condemn her.
Yeah, well, it's speaking of the condemned, who were the conspirators?
So in my opinion, the major conspirators were Marika, Mikola, and Rani. Rani is the first one that's very easily tied in, and she's the one shouted at like the game shouts her at you. I don't think the mystery ends there. Like we know, like I said before, we know that Marika knew the Black Knives very closely. And later we learned that the Black Knives seem to serve her purposes to some extent. Like, they guard Morget, who has been defending the Erd Tree, and we know that America's greatest wish right now is to just keep things in stasis because she wants, Godwyn to rise again and her. Well, personally, I think that the Night of the Black Knives goes beyond a simple assassination attempt, because its major effect is that enough demigods die during the Night of the Black Knives that when Queen Marika disappears after shattering the Elden Ring, order falls apart and people declare war on each other. There is no clear heir to the Elden Throne. Maybe the closest people that can claim it are people like Rykard or Radahn or Millennia, but then Morget throws his hat in the fray and he becomes a contender and everything gets complicated. But
Well, does he really throw his hat in there to be a contender for it? I kind of thought that he was just always opted to be a strong defender of it.
I think that's that's a very good point, and that's a good revision on my words, because Morget did not go for glory. Very specifically, he hates the flame of ambition that makes people go to war to fight each other. He wants to enforce an absolute peace and defend the Erd Tree no matter what. It's sort of I think that a lot of what George Martin wrote in Elden Ring somewhat mirrors what he wrote in Game of Thrones, and Lane mimics a lot of what happens. A lot of King's Landing vibes, like the great city, the it's unmatched in splendor, and Morget, like Varys, he wants to keep the peace of the city. He wants to protect it and the Erd Tree and the Golden Order against everything that might destroy it, no matter the chaos outside the gates.
And I would like to add like the failed infiltration of the city, like where there was one almost successful attempt, but then it was not successful. I feel like that mirrors it as well.
You mean the first and second defenses of Landel?
Yeah, right. Like they never fell.
Yes, so the city walls never fell except for the point when Grant Six and the Ancient Dragons attacked at the very beginning of time. The two
But
other
this,
attacks are coming up, one after the Night of the Black Knives, and then another after the Shattering itself. Yeah. Another parallel to the Game of Thrones, and sort of a gross one, is that Mikola and Millennia were probably a lot closer than we would like to think. Yeah, people are too caught up with Mog and stuff. Like, he's probably bewitched. We have to look at the Millennia being the desired champion of Nicola, which is basically marriage. A goddess and their champion, the god and their Elden Lord. Nicola and his blade Millennia, they were definitely up to
some hanky panky.
just a little. Yeah. So yeah, these three conspirators, Nicola, I think I think what happened was that Rani was needed for the magic. She was the one that could forge the knives. She was the one that could steal the rune of death. And she was the one that in Nicola's eyes would take the fall for it. But Rani knew this, so she decided to betray them at the end of the plot in her own way. I'll get to that in a second. I think that Marika saw the cracks in her own order and she didn't know what to do. She needed to snap it out of stasis and she needed to diffuse the growing tensions between inner and outer order, but she didn't know how to do that. Part of it was that she wanted to unleash Destin to death, but in a safe way that could reintegrate itself into the Golden Order. And I think that's where Mikola comes into play. He's known as the child prodigy. He's like a genius. He's supposed to be probably the smartest person in Elden Ring. So he might have had this idea, and I'm judging this by the two ghosts in Castle Sol, as well as his general vibe. But he might have had the idea that if Godwyn, the Prince of the Golden Order, can die a true death, then maybe he can rise again as the Prince of Undeath, and that would fix the Golden Order in some way. So, in that effect, the Knight of Black Knives was never meant to be a bloody night of assassination. It was meant to be a ritual that would create Godwyn the Golden as the Prince of Undeath. It would mark him with the true halo brand of Undeath. But as we know in game with Fia's questline, we have to reunite both halves. One of them was carved into Godwyn's flesh when he died, that it obliterated his soul, but he only died a half death. And that's because Ranni, at the exact moment of his death, betrayed her conspirators by carving half of the rune, half of the Hallowbrand, into her own immortal, undying Empyrean flesh to slay it, freeing herself from the Two Fingers' control, but in doing so, ruining the ritual. I think from there, Electo, who was the leader of the Black Knives, Electo meaning the Greek fate that snips the cord of death for like mortal people. I think Electo decided to go on a rampage throughout the city of Landel after killing Godwyn and failing in the ritual to just destabilize the order, or possibly some other sort of retaliation. And that's where you find the mausoleums of all of the dead fallen demigods with their souls being obliterated. It gets even more complicated, though, because if you go to the royal grounds that are in Ranni's secret ending, that you can only access by going through the underground ruins of Noxtella into the upper plateau that's raised above all of Liurnia, there you find the hiding Two Fingers. They're probably hiding from Ranni, to try and stay away from her, assassination attempt. Until the Tarnished helps her get there. But something you find also in that area is an Everjail, within it being Electo, the leader of the Black Knives, and you get the ashes for, I think, Black Knife Tish from her, Tish being Electo's daughter. Um, but essentially, what this could mean is that Ranni on that night imprisoned Electo. Part of her betrayal was that she imprisoned some of the Black Knives to destabilize Marika's control over the world for the coming Shattering, so that there were only a few Black Knives left that were then sent to, defend Morgott or to defend Mikola at the Ordina town, stuff like that. Sorry, that was
Wow.
yeah,
No, yeah, it's wow.
lots of speculation.
Not even speculation. I mean, it does make sense. I don't even know what about it exactly.
Yeah, no, that was a long explanation.
Well, I kept thinking to like ask my opinion, and I was just gonna be like keep going, but it just I don't know. It makes sense. I'm not sure even like really what to say about it.
I don't either. I was just trying to get all of the idea out there so that anyone it's like a complicated thought. It sort of feels like it has to be fully spoken to really get across well. Yeah, if you want a minute to just think of a response and we can edit.
I'm trying to. I'm mostly thinking about the Black Knives being spread out as a defense because they're
So
because which so I know you get Black Knife Tish from that area above where Ronnie is, but so was that their like leader?
yeah, I think it's like in Black Knight Tish's Ashes, it says that I'll look it up real quick. It says that she was the leader of the Black Knives.
Yeah, right.
And
Okay, but so then why are they defending these other points? Are they just trying to defend the rest of the greater?
well, I think that
Well,
Marika liked Morgott for defending the
if you have
it's
one
sort of
there,
yeah, so you have one there. I think that some
you
of
have
them chose to
one.
serve Mikola for longer, so they're in Ordina. I think the ones in the catacombs are in hiding.
Oh, that would actually make sense that the ones in the catacombs are in hiding because there's the one in the Altus Plateau. Right when you get in there, after defeating the Wervin that Why, wait, I think you said that word differently than I did, but
Wyvern?
wyvern.
What
Anyways,
word
do
is
you know what
it?
I'm talking? You know what I'm talking about? There's the dungeon in the Altus Plateau that's kind of hidden. Right after you get in there, if you go the back way that Raya talks about, it's like
The
right at the
Sage's Cave, I think. I'm
that might
looking
be
for
the name
the
of it. Yeah,
wiki.
it's it's to the right of where you kind of first meet the perfumers, in my opinion.
It's got like
Like the
the necromancer in it.
yeah, maybe, but it's the first time that you meet the assassins. I don't have a map in front of me, but it's like right after you enter the Altus Plateau, if you happen to go through where that Werven is. I forget the name of that tower. And then you enter out, and then there's those omen guys that you find in the sewers, like the big ones. But then like to the left of that, there's like a little like hidden uh dungeon. It was one of the only ones that I didn't get through my first playthrough. And when you go through there, there's a Black Knife assassin, and it's like one of the invisible ones. I think it's like one of the first times you can encounter, or I guess not even one of the first, because it's the only other time you can encounter a Black Knife assassin that is invisible.
Huh. Okay. Interesting.
Have you been into that dungeon? There's two bosses in it actually. It's really off putting. Have you been in there?
Yeah, I've done a couple of catacombs where there was like a secondary Black Knife
No, well
assassin.
this
On the wiki, I'm seeing that there's like four different bosses, four of them found. What were you gonna say?
Oh, I was just saying, and yeah, in that specific cave or dungeon or whatever you want to call it, there's like a boss fight that happens, but then like if you like you could think that's the end of it. So in that specific one, there's a lot of skeletons, and then you fight them all, and you end up at this boss door, and you can fight him, but then you don't get like drawn back to the top of it. If you progress through it further, there's a second boss fight, and the second boss fight is the Black Knife Assassin. And in that one, he's invisible, which the only other spot that they're invisible is Liturgical Town.
And does that one drop the concealing veil, do you think?
It is Sage's Cave.
Okay. Because yeah, that's with the necromancer and the concealing veil. Okay. Well, speaking of Sage's Cage, that actually has a really funny, like, I don't know, just weird little tangent going on, because there's this entire concept of necromancy in Elden Ring that isn't really, it feels cut. You know, I think I read in an interview that the incantation and sorcery system was implemented somewhat later in the game's development because they were thinking of putting in a different spell system. And I think that's supposed to be emblematic of how different spells work for different previous goddesses. You know, you've got the old arcane sort of um dragon invocations. It's called something special. I can't remember. It's like what you do
I don't know
to
what
eat
you're
their
talking about.
hearts and what the Drake Wardens do. And then you have incantations of faith for gods, and then you've got sorceries for knowledge. But like there was like this unfinished hex concept in the same way that in Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 2 the hex concept was added. And then there's this unfinished sort of necromancy idea. All of the different Rancor spells, along with the Omen Barons, create these dark spirit looking things that are essentially
Which
the game's way of like illustrating imagery wise like a soul that's angry, like an angry spirit, and that's why they chase you and do damage.
and they require both faith and intelligence, which is interesting.
It is interesting. Rykard
And,
notably does that with his ultimate attack, and then you can steal that ability from him by using his own like soul, like his remembrance.
uh,
Um, and the
and then you have the
necromancer. Oh, go on.
oh sorry. Oh, nothing. I was just gonna jump to the beast spells as well.
Yeah, no, I would have loved for more beast incantations. Speaking of them and incantations, if you look at the Godskin Apostle, that their incantation caster, it looks like the
And they have
Clawmark amulet
theirs
from the
too.
Beast incantations with an obsidian stone laid into it. Sort of like an idea. Another of my ideas that the Godskin Apostles are from the ancient time of the Beastmen comes from that idea and how they look similar.
Right.
As much as I'd like to go on talking about the spell system and aftermath of the Night of the Black Knives, we're well over our hour mark, so I think we'll have to save the rest of it for a part two. What do you think, Kaz?
Yeah, this has been really interesting, and I've learned a lot about the complexities of the lore as well as thrown out some crackpot theories, but I'd have to agree, we'll have to come back with a part two. There's just too much ground to cover in the lands between.
That's right. You'll have to check back with us in a fortnight to see our next episode, where we take a deep dive into the consequences of the Night of the Black Knives, the ensuing shattering and its many battles, and how everything just sort of falls apart afterwards. Not to mention some actual finality and the secret of Necromancer Garrus within the Sage's Cave.
Yeah, and I'd like to hear from our listeners, like if there's anything you guys want to hear on the Elden Ring lore or just ideas for episode topics. We're definitely open to covering some different things that you guys might be interested in. Thanks for watching and letting us know your thoughts and theories down below. And make sure to check out our sponsor Discord, our Elden Ring Discussion, which is now hosting a fan art contest for original FromSoft art. Definitely worth checking it out.
Yeah, I think they've even made their own subreddit over there for it. While you're at it, eldenringdiscussion.net is a great website built by some real knowledgeable content creators such as Amir, Orphicos, Ouroboros, other people, and many more people. You can get the full list of contributors on their website. It's got a survey function to gather feedback from the community, well thought out articles discussing various mechanics, and even a rather vast yet unorganized collection of PvP data for utilities sake.
Yeah, I remember when I checked it out, I particularly liked the spreadsheets where you can input your stats and your weapons and whatnot to see damage output. It was really cool and well put together, very professional. But yeah, anyway, so finishing things off, we are happy to announce that the PC DS3 servers are back online as of 8/25. So y'all better be best getting online to celebrate. Thank you for joining us at the Roundtable Hold. This has been Cosmosis.
And this has been Gideon.
And yeah, goodbyes are hard.